and welcome. This is Business Edge right here on News Central. I'm Tolulope Adeleru Balogun. We have our headline story for you. South Africa's economy rebounds in Q3. And that's some great news for the continent and particularly for South Africa. We'll get into the details of that. Don't forget, we also have NC4 to watch for you as we wrap things up. This is Business Edge. Welcome. So let's get straight into the show. South Africa's gross domestic product has rebounded by a massive 66.1% in the third quarter of the year. This reflects the economy's recovery from the height of the COVID-19 lockdown. This is on a seasonally adjusted and annualized basis. Statistics South Africa cleared up its GDP figures after some confusion during the second quarter release, which showed a 51% decline in GDP due to the lockdown. The data reflects the latest quarter compared to the immediately preceding quarter, that is 2020 Q3 and 2020 Q2. According to Statistics SA, there are seasonal differences between quarters, such as weather conditions and how they influence agricultural production, while the holidays of Easter and the festive season influence trade, transport, and accommodation. And year-end closures influence construction and many business services, which add complications to the assessment. To ensure that these comparisons remain valid, the data is seasonally adjusted. The quarter-on-quarter growth rates can be annualized to show that the annual rate what the annual rates would be if the quarter-on-quarter rates were to occur 4 times in succession. However, the annualized rate only provides a crude forecasting model that is useful in times of stable economic performance, but less so in a highly volatile environment. And this was part of the warning that the statistics body issued. Now, to discuss this, I have joining me on this show economist, researcher, and global tax advisor for Action Aid, Mtwalo Msoni, and he's going to be getting into the nitty-gritty of the issues surrounding South Africa's economy and the gross domestic product. Mtwalo, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine.
All right, so let's start with the gross domestic product for South Africa. I said a lot of words that many people not in the business environment it's just English and grammar. So let's break it down for them. So the GDP has been adjusted and annualized in South Africa. In basic layman terms, what does this mean?
Well, to annualize basically means to convert a short-term figure, a short-term ratio, or short-term projection into something over a long term. So in this case, we are actually annualizing the GDP, converting a GDP for a short term, for a quarter, and forecasting it over a longer period, which is on an annual basis. Mm-hmm. It's important to mention that annualizing makes the assumption that each and every quarter happens the same weather patterns, the same conditions for trade, the same conditions to support the manufacturing sector, the same conditions to support the agriculture sector. So an annualized GDP rate might not be essentially reflective of what has happened over the past year or what has happened over the past couple of months, but is more reflective of what has happened in the short term if it was to happen on a continuous basis over a period of time, and in this case, over a year. So the 66% we're talking about is not necessarily reflective of how much the GDP is actually growing at, because of this assumption that what is happening in this quarter is probably what will happen for the rest of the year. So I'd want to look at a 13.1% quarterly to quarterly adjustment, which is not annualized, as maybe a reflection of the GDP growth in this case.
Okay, and it's interesting enough that you bring up that point, because Statistics South Africa says they're looking to start consultation on non-annualized gross domestic product. And this is something that we saw Zimbabwe do just a few years ago and just a few years before the country entered recession. Will it bring about any difference, particularly in your opinion, before we get into the numbers and the nitty-gritty?
Of course, an annualized GDP makes more assumptions than a non-annualized GDP ratio. For most of the GDP rates that countries work with to project their growth and to analyze their growth over a period of time, they would want to look at GDP from a year-to-year basis. And if you look at it in terms of the data that has been released by Statistics South Africa, of course, we would see that there's actually been a decline in the growth rate. It's been projected to be -6, which is more reflective of what has happened over a longer period of time. So annualizing might be important in terms of telling us where we're getting the things right, where we need to probably work with the law of comparative advantage and develop the sector. But to some extent, it would also be misleading because the 66% growth rate would mean South Africa is doing very well, when in actual reality, when you look at it from a year-to-year basis, it's actually -6 in terms of growth.
Okay, so let's get into what is doing well, what sectors are doing well. And what it seems like is, even though we've seen some growth, it is smaller compared to where South Africa was last year. We had some sectors that were absolutely decimated by the lockdown and the pandemic's impact on demand. We saw mass retrenchment and some continuing uncertainty as well. But we also did see some, I guess we would say, good news in all of this. Manufacturing, trade, and mining saw strong growth, and there was also a notable jump in construction work after 8 straight quarters of contractions. So where are the true pluses? Where are the true positives in this news that we're hearing right now, and where do we still need to keep our eyes because of concerns for the potential uncertainty of the future?
The true positives are, as you had put, in the manufacturing sector. The manufacturing sector has grown in terms of its production capacity to about
Okay, of course, as you know, with technology, we can't always be sure what's going to happen, but we're going to make sure we get Mtwalo back, and we're looking at South Africa and how they're really faring with the economy and the GDP. I think he is back now, so let's continue that conversation on where the positives are and where the concerns should be. Mtwalo, I believe you're back with us now?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes,
go ahead.
I had cut off a little bit.
No problem.
I was saying that the manufacturing sector has grown by 44 billion rands in terms of its ability to produce goods and services. If you look at trade has grown by 40 billion rands as well in the third quarter. Mining has grown by 29 billion rands. And the only decline that is notable is in the agricultural sector, which has declined by 5 billion rands. And of course, we do know that this is on an annualized basis. So it's a projection of a short term over a longer term. But it actually tells us that there have been some improvements in what would be South Africa's traditional comparative advantage over its neighbors in the region, the manufacturing and trade, which have grown, and probably this signals potential for growth. I should say, from an economist point of view, this is more impressive than we originally thought it would be. But it's important to mention that even this growth in real terms by 13.1% on a quarter-by-quarter basis is less than the 16.6% decline that we saw. So we're on the route to recovery, better trajectory in terms of outcomes, but there's still a long way to go and still more that needs to be done.
So you mentioned an R word that many economies are trying to make sure they're working on, and that is recovery. But there's another R word that has been attached to South Africa, unfortunately, in the past few months, and that's recession. So it was in September when South Africa's gross domestic product fell for the 4th consecutive quarter, and that puts the country squarely in severe recession. It was announced then that the GDP fell by just over 16.4%, what you've referenced now, between the first quarter in the second quarter. So now looking at this rebound of the economy, do you think that South Africa is now officially out of recession, or are they still on the road out of recession?
South Africa are on the road out of recession, better outcomes than we would have predicted and actually thought, potentially because of now the easing of lockdown restrictions, increased demand for commodities that are traditionally manufactured out of South Africa. It's important to mention that in this case, most of this can be attributed to some of what is being called the economic stimulus package, the Ramaphosa package that's pumping in lots of money into economy, helping to support some of the recovery. But I'll still mention that on a year-to-year basis, we are still in negative terms in terms of gross domestic product, and this is where we're likely going to close at the end of the year. So we are on the road, still in the early stages of recovery, but we should be able to make it if the manufacturing and trade sector continue to grow and mining output continues to grow as we have seen it grow by 29 billion in the third quarter. Okay,
we're going to take a break. You mentioned the stimulus package, and we need to talk about that. Is there a future for the stimulus under President Cyril Ramaphosa? We'll also talk about the Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni, and some few things coming from none other than our favorite focus, South African Airlines. The conversation will continue right here on Business Edge. Stay with us. You are still watching Business Edge on News Central. I still have a global tax advisor with Action Aid with me from the southern part of the continent. Mtwalo Msoni is still with me. Let's talk about stimulus. You mentioned it just before we went on the break, but do you think South Africa is in a position to continue with its stimulus drive towards boosting the economy? We know that it was just a few weeks ago that the President Cyril Ramaphosa announced a 100 billion rand employment stimulus package. We also know that, as you said earlier, they've been trying to really push money back into the economy, and that comes by way of construction a lot for many governments. So do you think South Africa can continue on the stimulus path, and how much longer can they do this?
Well, South Africa has, of course, also mentioned in its economic recovery plan to say that stimulus package is something that they would look out for. I think it's a big part of the ERRP, and we of course know that South Africa, amongst emerging economies, had pumped in as much as 10% of their gross domestic product in terms of COVID stimulus. Most of this going to the health sector, support and employment, wage bills for local authorities, and 10% of it going to social transfers. The extent to which South Africa would be able to continue with this is dependent largely on how the money that was already pumped into 10% of GDP has performed and will be able to get favorable outcomes. Of course, we do know that the opportunity cost with getting so much money and pumping into COVID recovery, seeing that the current fiscal space is constrained, there are issues of debt that now reaching alarming levels. If you look at the debt to GDP ratio over 90%, and the issues of little domestic resource mobilization being collected compared to previous years because of lockdowns and reduction in demand. So the extent to which South Africa would be able to continue with this would depend largely on the outcomes of the packages that they have given out. And I foresee for the near future, because it's part of the recovery plan, that South Africa will continue boosting its economy by pumping in money in terms of COVID recovery to the essential sectors, and to as well support initiatives like the unemployment initiative that you had mentioned. Sustainability, very difficult to tell. Of course, among its emerging economies, South Africa is actually putting in more money in terms of GDP compared to Russia, compared to China, compared to Saudi Arabia, compared to India, and is almost at the levels of Spain and the United States. So you can actually see how much this means in terms of GDP rates for COVID recovery for South Africa.
So let's talk about a specific entity that for the longest time South Africa has been attempting to stimulate to profitability. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni announced a bailout yet again for South African Airways. And what we know was that bailout was announced in October, and it was a 10.5 billion rand bailout. That's about $640 million. This is an airline that has not been profitable for more than 10 years. The government has continued the bailouts. There is administration in play as well for the airlines. There's issues with the unions. There's issues with severance packages. But talking about how much South African Airways has gulped from the South African economy, what is the future? Because it is supposed to be an earner of revenue for the government. It's supposed to be an employment generator as well for government, but that has not been the case. So where we are right now is another bailout. So do we know if it has been paid? Do we know what the latest situation is concerning that bailout to the government and those who are administering South African Airways right now?
So the 10.5 billion rand bailout is expected to be paid in January 2020. And of course, we do know that most of it is already targeted funds and is very unlikely to actually make the South African airline recover. Of course, 2.8 billion is already been taken towards South African Airways just getting back in the air. 2.2 billion would be probably going to pay workers who would lose their jobs. There are already plans that have been listed down in terms of cutting down staff from 4,800 to 1,000. All these need to be paid. Currently, South African Airways is not as active, yet their wage bill still stands. So they're still dwindling down and continuing down the debt path. And what we've heard as the latest is probably government trying to afford about 400 million US dollars, in terms of which they want to use South African Airways in terms of getting rid of some of their debt, making them in a position where they can operate. And as the Vice President said, continue to be the flag barrier, continue to be an industry that supports tourism, continue to be an industry that supports local produce and is able to contribute to employment and tourism sectors efficiently. So this is what's obtaining around the South African Airways saga.
Okay, well, watch to see how that plays out, because many are concerned. Some have said it's like taking from the poor to give to the well-to-do. It's a very controversial issue, and we know how strong unions can be when it comes to politics, but it is an issue that continues to bedevil South Africa. So finally, before we wrap up, we quickly need to touch on the issue of debt, and that's a very big issue for many African countries now. So debt has risen in South Africa. Before, in 2017, it was 53.02% of the GDP. As of 2018, it has increased by over 3 percentage points and now stands at 56.71% of South Africa's GDP. So we're looking at recovery. We've heard Cyril Ramaphosa talk about the fact that Western countries and international lenders need to give debt relief and some kind of debt, again, as I said, relief to African countries because of Corona to help the economies to recover. In terms of the debt that South Africa is carrying right now, in terms of moving out of recession and trying to get the economy back on a better footing, where do we stand? Is the country under the administration of President Ramaphosa handling the debt crisis? Because I think it is a crisis for many African countries. Are they handling the debt crisis adequately in your estimation?
Well, if you look at the statement by Cyril Ramaphosa in October, making projections on probably what's going to happen in South Africa over the midterm, I think he had talked about measures that would return South Africa to more domestic revenue dependent country. But of course, this is notwithstanding the fact that COVID and COVID recovery will still hamper the ability of the country to generate more revenues. There was no concrete plan that was shared on how South Africa would want to get out of the debt trap, borrow less and finance more of its economic recovery and look at financing more of infrastructure development, which is being looked at as strategic. But one pointer that would be there is we're likely to see an increase in the taxes for South Africa and an increase in the tax base to try to fund COVID recovery and try to see how South Africa can borrow less of these funds. Right now, the outlook is a little bit worrying. There have been increasing statements that have been coming out of South Africa from the minister as well, warning that South Africa might be headed to debt levels that have been seen in Zambia if they continue on the same trajectory. So it's a little bit worrying for now, but of course we have seen this across many developing countries that have to borrow to finance some of their development and finance some of their health and education expenditure, seeing that we're in pandemic times and domestic resource mobilization has been constrained. Essentially, that's what obtaining in South Africa concerns.
So I'll ask this very simple question to wrap up. If we're looking at taxes, because I was going to ask about that, and you're talking about expanding the tax net and getting more people in, can South Africans pay more taxes? Can they pay more in taxes?
The tax base is currently constrained. South Africans feel that they're paying a lot of taxes, but there's one thing that we can probably look at, which is sealing probably existing loopholes in terms of tax avoidance, strengthening the ability of SARS to be more efficient in their tax collection, probably look at a base that was proposed early during the pandemic period of wealth taxes, look at how South Africa can tap into the wealth of the most wealthiest and try to look if it can raise some revenue that can ease pressure in terms of government spending and borrowing from that. So this is probably what they would be looking at. Tax is only efficient if it's progressive, if it looks at taxing the most well-to-do in society and gives relief to the less well-to-do in society. So if we're looking at expanding the tax base or introducing the tax base, it will only be efficient to the extent to which the tax incident, the tax burden lies on the ones who can actually afford to let go of a few extra rands to finance development and so many other things that are needed now during this pandemic period.
All right, thank you so much for joining me, Mtwalo Msoni. We appreciate your contributions, economist, researcher, and global tax advisor for Action Aid. We look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
All right, so let's wrap things up with NC4 to watch as promised, because I like to be a woman of my word. Kenya, UK sign economic partnership agreement to promote regional trade. Now, Kenya and the United Kingdom have signed a strategic economic partnership agreement following the conclusion of recent negotiations between the two countries. The agreement, to secure the mutual interest of the two partners after Brexit, replicates the effects of the East African Community with the European Union that facilitates EAC exports free of duties and quotas to the European market. Now moving to part of a conversation we just had, Statistics South Africa. Statistics South Africa has said that they are considering moving away from using the annualized quarterly change in gross domestic product as its main measure for the performance of the economy. The Statistics Office will start consultations with its user community early next year about the possibility of switching focus to the non-annualized quarter-on-quarter seasonally adjusted figure. And this is according to Joe De Beer, Deputy Director General of the Economic Statistics. Now coming to West Africa, the Nigerian government's earnings from the export of crude oil have recorded a rebound of 116%, according to the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. OPEC said that the rebound was recorded in November this year as compared to levels of April 2020. The 13-nation intergovernmental organization, of which Nigeria is a member, said that the country's oil revenues had dropped drastically by 77% between January and April of this year. And finally, to the east, where the National Bank of Ethiopia recently issued a directive allowing Ethiopian residents and non-residents to open and operate foreign currency accounts in the country. The directive is one of the many reforms in the country's financial sector aimed at liberalizing the sector. And with NC4 to watch, we've come to the end of this edition of Business Edge. Don't forget to head to our website and social media accounts for more business and financial news from across the continent. Until next time, I'm Tolulope Adeleru Balogun.